Okay, let's see how this goes. This is a bit of an experiment for me, this live streaming business, but I'm going to be doing more of it in the months to come. So let's get right into it. This is this video, this stream here is going to be me introducing kind of series of classes I'm going to be doing probably over the next few months, potentially longer, on various different topics. But the kind of overarching, I think, theme and ethos of them will be revolving around the field of Yangsheng, or Yangsheng Fa, meaning nourishing life methods in Chinese medicine. And so this class, we're going to be sort of introducing the field. What is Yangsheng? What is Yangsheng really all about? And how am I going to navigate it, teaching it? Because my approach, as it's developed over the last, I guess, few years to this field has become, I think, somewhat unique, and I want to, in this class, lay out some of the sort of basic principles that organize my thinking around it, and that I think ought to organize just our approach to it and to Chinese medicine in general. So it's a kind of broader sort of overview, theoretically and philosophically, of what Yangsheng really is. Yangsheng, of course, like I said, these are the characters for Yangsheng here. It means nourishing life, or sometimes people say nourishing vitality. It is a system of teachings, or a collection of teachings from the Chinese medical tradition, which relate to the preservation of health and life. But of course, as we'll explore, in Chinese medicine, health is not just, as we think of it in sort of the Western world, purely health of the physical body, but health of the whole embodied being, basically. So our emotional health and our physical health, which in Chinese medicine are integrally connected, are essentially one. And we're going to be, in this class, exploring some fundamental concepts relating to this, one being wind, or feng in Chinese, the concept of wind, broadly defined, and virtue, or de, as it relates to this. And the way that I'm framing this, this comes from a class that I taught a while ago. I'm framing it around these two sort of approaches to Yangsheng, which are healing from the outside in and healing from the inside out. Let's see. Here we go. So, right, this is much of what I just discussed. I haven't looked at this slideshow for a little bit. Yangsheng means nourishing life, and they are teachings to promote health. They are teachings, it should be mentioned, that, of course, they are medical in nature, are not just in Chinese medicine or in the tradition coming out of explicitly medical sources, medical texts, but also figure prominently in Taoist and Buddhist traditions. In fact, a lot of the Yangsheng teachings come from Taoist sources traditionally, and there are many more specific methods, which won't really be necessarily covered too much in this class necessarily, which are almost specific to Taoist methods of cultivation and stuff like this. This is not a class on Taoist or Buddhist methods of cultivation or how Yangsheng figures into them, yet those traditions are basically form the basis and bedrock of Chinese medicine, as I understand it, certainly Taoism especially. Chinese medicine can be understood as a branch of a kind of tree of many different interrelated fields and areas of inquiry and study and practice. The root of them really being the embodied cultivation exercises that are highly linked with Taoist traditions, things like internal alchemy and Neigong and stuff like that. And Chinese medicine and Chinese medical teachings are kind of a branch of that, which many other areas of study traditionally are as well, including things like feng shui or even astrology. So all that is to say, these traditions will kind of be in the background of much of our discussion. The general ethos of Chinese medicine is one of preventative healthcare. It's preventative medicine. We could say that in some ways, I have a colleague who likes to say, in America today, or really in the whole world, because of the dominant medical system we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system, meaning that we have a medical system which is primarily oriented around treating illness when it arises, but not necessarily around promoting health explicitly. And I think that's a pretty fair critique of our medical system as it stands. You go to the doctor when you're sick. You don't generally go to the doctor. Maybe you go for a yearly checkup or something like that, but you don't generally go to the doctor to promote wellness. Whereas Chinese medicine is really oriented fundamentally around promoting wellness, and of course has many methods and ways of navigating sickness, which for most human lives is an inevitable part of the journey at some point. But the medical tradition is really most fundamentally oriented around promoting health. There's a famous story, and who knows if this is actually true, but it certainly illustrates the point, that people say that in the small villages in China, the village doctor would not be paid when people got sick, because and would only be paid when people were healthy. Whether or not this is true, who knows? But it is certainly a nice idea, because what it shows is that the role of the doctor is not primarily to treat people when they get sick, but is to keep people healthy. Once you have let someone get sick, the idea is you've already allowed something to kind of go astray. That said, of course, illness, like I said, is an inevitable part of life for most people, and is something that, in a sense, is a teaching. It's a teaching for us to see that there is a way in which we have let something go astray in our systems. We've allowed something to get off kilter or off balance, which initially may have been a small way that the body sort of cried out for help, or some subtle imbalance in our lives or our lifestyle or our system. And if we did not deal with it or tend to it, it will tend to speak more and more loudly to us until we are forced to reckon with it. And so the healing process, of course, is fundamentally a process of healing, of learning, if we engage with it wholeheartedly. So anyway, this idea that medicine should fundamentally be engaged as a kind of preventative form of healthcare is reflected in the hierarchy of intervention in Chinese medicine. So we see this in early texts from the Zhou dynasty, which is the earliest dynasty we have in recorded record in China, where in the imperial kind of court, the doctors that served the emperor were classified in a kind of hierarchy of three levels. So the lowest level master doctors serving the imperial family were the surgeons, actually. The middle level ones were general practitioners, meaning acupuncturists and herbalists, people who do the kind of work that I myself do. And then the highest level master doctors were dietitians, actually, were people who were focusing on dietary therapy. Now, this, of course, is an interesting hierarchy, because it shows us something that in our culture we wouldn't be necessarily, we wouldn't expect. which is that it is the dietitians who are in some ways given the most prestige and thought of as the highest level practitioners of the art of medicine. In our culture, it is the exact opposite, of course, right? Surgeons are given the most prestige, they make the most money. I'm told by friends who have gone through Western medical education that the surgeons are, that's the kind of it's somehow sexy to be a surgeon, in kind of the world of Western medicine, right? In the Chinese medical understanding, surgery actually would be considered the kind of lowest level on the hierarchy if we were to have a hierarchy of intervention, because by the time someone needs surgery, that is a sign that something has gone seriously wrong on many different levels that presumably could have been rectified and dealt with on the level of perhaps acupuncture or herbs, or taking medicines in different ways, or even before that, on the level of lifestyle, of Yangsheng, which is what we're looking at here, is the healthy lifestyle teachings of Chinese medicine. Because the idea is that if you affect something on the level of lifestyle, on the level of diet or exercise or your sleep cycle or something like that, if you rectify the imbalance on that level, it may never get to the point where you need actual medical intervention. And if it does get to that point, you deal with it on the level of medical intervention, then you will never need the surgery, basically. So, one reason today, people look at the history of Chinese medicine, they say, oh, well, they never developed surgery because it was primitive medicine or something like that. It's only in modern times we understand how to do surgery. Well, maybe that's part of it. Of course, they didn't have the hygiene practices that we have today, or various, pain-killing drugs and things like that to put people under. Sure, that's obviously part of the reason why surgery didn't develop. Another reason, though, perhaps, is that their orientation medically was around preventing the body from getting to that place in the first place. And actually, there was surgery performed in China. The famous Dr. Hua To famously performed surgery. I think that was quite early on in China's medical history, maybe 2nd century. I'm not sure. If anyone knows, you can put in comments. But there was some surgery. Anyway, so we have this, and even this hierarchy of intervention is reflected in even the way that herbs are classified in the earliest texts in Chinese medicine. In the Shenang Ben Sao Jing, the earliest materia medica, the herbs are classified in these 3 levels. The level of herbs that simply support well-being and vitality, make someone more kind of spiritually vibrant and nourish life, basically, nourish their life. The second level of herbs is to deal with kind of constitutional imbalances that have formed. Sort of these disharmonies in the body, which haven't necessarily manifested as really acute serious illness yet, but are leanings of the body out of balance one way or another. And the kind of lowest grade herbs, so to speak, are the herbs that are heavier hitting in some ways and are used to rectify illness when it has manifested. And of course, the most skilled doctor we read time and time again in Chinese medical classics is the one who treats illness before it manifests at all. Which means that, I was just saying this to a friend today, actually. We were talking about Chinese medicine, and he's also a practitioner of healing arts, massage therapist, but how, the more skilled a medical practitioner is, the more they are going to be helping people in ways that those people will never know or understand. And so being a Chinese medicine practitioner is really not the sort of thing that you should do for glory, because ideally 90% of what you do for people, they never know that you did it, because it prevents them from having any illness or prevents things from getting worse or something like that. And we only tend to notice things when they get bad. We don't tend to notice that someone has redirected us towards health. So it's a funny thing. So you don't actually, you don't get the glory necessarily for that kind of work, but it's the good work to do. So Yangsheng, nourishing life, is divided into four. There are four components that are considered the most important in the tradition. There are many others, actually, many other aspects of life that are developed or that are discussed in texts that discuss Yangsheng. But these are the four, were considered the four pillars of Yangsheng, or you could say the four legs of the chair, or the four legs of the stool, because if you have a four-legged chair, a four-legged stool, if you remove one leg, the whole thing topples over. And that's the idea of these four pillars of health, is that if you remove one, or if one of them becomes out of balance, it will pull everything else out of balance. And so it's another way of thinking about this is if you have an issue with one, you'll often end up with issues with others as well. So they are diet and eating, dietetics. They are sleep and rest. They are movement and exercise. And finally, mind and emotions. So again, if one has issues, say there's an issue with getting good sleep, right? If one's sleep is impaired in some way, that is going to tend to affect their energy levels the next day, and that will tend to affect their ability to have a healthy movement and exercise regimen, which in turn will potentially make them crabby or affect their emotions in a negative way, which in turn may cause imbalances in their system, which are going to cause eating habits, which are emotionally driven and not driven based on a gentle and attentive listening to what their body actually needs. And so often if one of these, just in terms of how you see things unfold for people, if one of these things is impaired, often they all kind of get warped or distorted in some way. And so when working with people or when working with ourselves, we can think, okay, even if I have some issue, even if my sleep isn't ideal or my diet isn't ideal or my movement isn't ideal, which one of these parameters do I think is most important to address first? And if I rectify that, will it help to bring the others into balance? And of course, we should ideally be thinking about all of them, trying to bring them all into balance for ourselves. Like I said, there are other components discussed in Yangsheng texts. Some common one is talking about how to have a healthy and well-regulated sex life. Yangsheng texts talk about raising children, how to raise children in a healthy way, support the different cycles of life and phases and seasons of life, how to affect old age in a positive way, the aging process, which is something that I'll inevitably do classes about at some point, even how to die in a healthy way. There's even teachings on enjoyment of music and art and stuff like that, which in certain texts are considered part of Yangsheng, part of nourishing life. So it can actually be quite a broad thing. Because it's one of the things that I really appreciate more and more about Chinese medicine is in the West, I think we tend to compartmentalize medicine and put it in this particular corner of culture and of human life. I go about my life, and then if I get sick, I go to the doctor, and my medicine is sort of its own kind of realm. But in the Chinese medical tradition, it's deeply integrated with everything. Even so much so that even the way that we appreciate music has a component that's related to our health and well-being. And certainly traditionally arts like feng shui, which would affect how one sets up their living space or something like that, can have a profound effect on health. The way that what one's work or vocation is, all these different things. So it's a topic that has broad and far-reaching implications for considerations of our lives. So before we get into the specifics of these things. In this class, I'm not going to be talking too much about either any of these 4 pillars. I'm going to talk more about the general approach to them. We want to ask the very basic question: what is health? Fundamentally, what is health and what is illness? And there's obviously many ways to answer this question. In Chinese medicine, or yi is a term that's used both to refer to medicine kind of as the field of medicine and also to the practice of medicine. So it's kind of both a noun and a verb. Medicine is fundamentally, I think we could say, the study of human life, flourishing, and disease. And one thing that is really stressed in the Chinese medical tradition and in sort of Chinese philosophy and Chinese arts in general is that life is a process. Human life is a process. It's not a static, stable thing. It is a process, and processes unfold across time. And understanding this, we have to understand that in Chinese medicine, illnesses are verbs, not nouns. And this is really, really important in the way that we conceptualize illness. In the West, there's a tendency to, we talk about illnesses as though they're nouns, right? I have cancer, right? Cancer is a thing that I have. I have irritable bowel syndrome. Like it's a noun. It's a static thing that I have. Whereas in Chinese medicine, we do not relate with illnesses in that way. Of course, we do discuss diseases, Bing, in Chinese, and in a way they are talked about as a noun. It's running piglet chi or something like that, right? But underlying all of these Bing, all these diseases, is an understanding of a process, and this is an important piece for how the thought process behind Chinese medicine. We are always oriented to processes. And this is useful in many ways. One is that we have less of a tendency to identify with processes. So in Chinese medicine, it would be more true to say, I am going through a cancer process than to say I have cancer. And although that might just seem like an issue of semantics, it's not. I am going through a cancer process does not imply that cancer is essentially connected to who I am or what I am. It's not an identity that I can adopt. It's just a thing that I'm going through. Whereas saying I have cancer, you see this often with many illnesses in our culture. There's a real tendency for people to identify with them, right? I am a cancer survivor, or I am which of course there's nothing wrong owning that. It can be empowering for people on some level. Yet ultimately these kinds of illnesses as identities can be limiting because they limit our sense of ourselves, and they also, from a Chinese medicine perspective, can really limit the healing process. Because once we're attached to something and attached to a state of being as part of our identity, it's actually harder to let go of it and allow it to change. The beautiful thing about understanding that illnesses are verbs, are processes, is that processes can always change, which is why, when you go to a Chinese medicine doctor, if they're the real deal, you're usually not getting the same kind of, I'm sorry, Miss Jones, you have X, Y, and Z. Like, this means this necessarily. Like, of course, there are illnesses that have gone so far that there is a kind of inevitability to their unfolding in certain ways. Yet there is much more of a recognition in the tradition that things can change. Even many things that, from a Western medicine perspective, are often thought of as unchangeable, just almost simply because we think of them as nouns. In Chinese medicine, they're verbs, so it's a different thought process, right? And like I said, processes, verbs unfold through time. So the study of time is really important in Chinese medicine. We'll return to that in just a moment. Related to this idea of processes and change is this very famous line from the Huangdi Neijing, which is the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which is the earliest and most foundational text of the Chinese medical tradition. It is divided into two different texts. One is the Neijing Su Wen, which is the basic questions, and one is the Ling Shu. Ling Shu means sort of often translated as spiritual pivot, which is the foundational text for the principles of acupuncture, whereas the Su Wen is more basic principles about health and disease and sort of Chinese medicine theory in a broader sense. This line comes up multiple times in different forms, slightly different, but it's basically wind brings the 100 diseases. And at this time in Chinese culture, 100 diseases, 100 just is a stand-in for a really big number, which is basically everything. So it's a way of saying all disease. In later texts, it becomes the 10,000. 10,000 is the number that's used, the 10,000 things, basically saying all things, the myriad things, or the myriad diseases. So this is saying, basically it's a big statement, which is saying wind brings all disease. That's the kind of classical understanding, right? Now, that's a big statement, and so it is imperative that we understand what wind is, because it's not immediately clear what that means. What does it mean that wind brings all disease? People who have studied Chinese medicine, especially modern forms of Chinese medicine, modern TCM, will be familiar with wind primarily as one of the 6 climactic factors, a pathogenic factor, which affects the body in various different ways. There's external wind, which one can contract externally. There's internal wind, which often manifests as tics or tremors or qi moving erratically through the system. In this case, kind of classical classical interpretation of this line, which I'm working from, is using the term wind in a much broader sense. In early Chinese medical texts and just texts in general, wind is used much more broadly to refer to kind of pathological energies in general, although sometimes not even just pathology, just processes. And in this case, wind is a metaphor for change. That is essentially what this means. So what we have is a line that actually means change brings all disease. And I think wind is it's an appropriate metaphor for change, right? In terms of when we walk out into the forest or on a blustery, windy day and we look around, there's change everywhere, right? The whole manifest world is sort of swirling around and changing quickly. The leaves of the branches, the swirling leaf, brush on the ground, everything is moving, everything is changing. You can feel that very strongly on a windy day. Wind, I think, it's a good metaphor for change. Yet even understanding that, it makes it hard. It's hard to understand what this line means because, well, of course, change brings all disease, sure, but change also brings health, right? Change brings everything in life because life itself, as we said, or did we say that? Well, life is a process of change, right? Life is a process of change. So really, ultimately, what this means is that illness comes from our bodies or our system's inability to adapt to change. So it is our resistance to change which brings all illness. That's the sort of deeper meaning behind this line. Wind brings the 100 diseases, and so this is an important piece because this explains the fundamental cause of illness from a Chinese medicine perspective, which you are going to find in any illness at all, which is that illness is a way that we as embodied human beings struggle to adapt to the inevitable changes that life brings, whether changes externally that we are struggling to adapt to, changes in our lives, changes in our relationships, changes in our sense of self, or internal changes in terms of the the food that just entered this body, that this body is struggling to adapt to the presence of, changes to the pathogen that I just breathed in from the environment, that this change that's occurring that I'm struggling to adapt to. Even on the really kind of acute level, maybe I get in a car accident and I get whiplash, and my body has struggled to adapt to the changing movement pattern that was so fast, and so the body locked up and gripped. It is the kind of gripping and resistance in response to change. I'll go back to the slide for a second. In response to change, which leads to the patterns of contraction, tension, and resistance, which lead to processes, pathological processes, basically. Another reason wind is such a good metaphor here is if we think about what it's like to have a cold wind blowing on our back. Maybe we're standing on top of a mountain, there's a cold wind that rushes and blows on our back and blows on this region of the back, which is actually called the wind gate in Chinese medicine, a place where wind can enter the body. What happens to our body? This, right? We tense up. This part of our body tenses up. With the wind at our back, we resist the wind, right? We tense in response to the wind. This is essentially a metaphor for what is happening in any process where our body is struggling to adapt to the presence of change. Now, contrary to this, is the basic principle for health in Chinese medicine, which is an absence of struggle adapting to change. It is a sort of flowing along with the changes of our lives, which in Taoism is expressed through this concept of wu wei, or non-doing or non-governing, it's often said, connected to all these other important concepts in Taoism, like flowing along with, or being at ease, or a perfect fit with the world, a kind of unself-consciousness, or sort of residing in a natural state of being. So it is this allowing of an unfolding of life that is the principle for health, basically. So the really notable thing about this way of framing what health is, in these very broad terms, which really separates Chinese medicine from our dominant medical paradigm in terms of how we think, is it's notable that in this paradigm, death is not a sign of illness, right? Death in and of itself is simply a change. It's simply a change that the embodied process goes through. It's a change that we go through. Death becomes pathological when we resist it, So, like I said, changes, of course, inevitably unfold across time, right? Human life being a process of change, of course, we're changing from the moment we are born to the moment we die, right? To be a human is to be a verb, not a noun. There's nothing about this human life that does not change, even moment to moment. Everything in our system, certainly on an embodied level, is going through processes of growth and decay and rebirth. Our heart is pumping, we're cycling through each moment. Health is a process of living in harmony with the changing rhythms of time, basically. And as I mentioned, part of Yangsheng is teachings about how to live properly in relationship with different seasons of life, to harmonize with these different seasons of life. The earliest chapters of the Neijing Suwen are a dialogue between kind of the student and the master doctor about what is proper and healthy for the different seasons of life. When someone is a child, when they go through puberty, as they age, how long they should live, these different cycles of existence. Because to be healthy and what's appropriate for one at one age and one cycle of life is not necessarily what's right for another. So So health is really a matter of harmonizing and synchronizing ourselves with the proper timing, basically, with what's appropriate for the time that we find ourselves in. So big part of this is harmonizing our body's rhythms, natural rhythms, with the cycles of nature, with the cycles of the natural world. So we have these cycles. We have the life cycle as a whole, which, of course, or I'll back up for a moment and explain this sort of in terms of these principles of yin and yang, because this is a framework that we'll come back to many times throughout the class. It's a really fundamental one for understanding Yangsheng. Life is kind of this, I have this sort of bell curve here to show that life is a process of kind of these cycles of growth and maturity, and then decline and decay. Those of you familiar with the Wu Xing, the 5 phases or 5 elements as it's sometimes translated, which we'll talk about more in a moment, will understand that this process can be mapped onto the Wu Xing, with the wood phase relating to the kind of birth of something, the beginnings of something, moving into the fire phase, which is the things kind of come to full expression, to maturity, the center of this bell curve. Things then moving into a state of sort of decline, which would be the metal phase, and then to a state of kind of ending in death, which would be the water phase, the phase kind of between each cycle. We can see this more broadly, and of course, Earth in different frameworks is simply the pivot time between these different changes, or if we're talking seasonally, there's a particular seasonal time associated with the Earth, which we can talk about in a moment. But this general kind of bell curve can be understood really basically as a waxing and waning of yin and yang, the principles of yin and yang. So the beginning of it, right, the birth of anything, the beginning of anything is the rising of yang, right? Yang rises, reaches its apex, and then it starts to decline as yin increases and then reaches its apex. So the life cycle as a whole can be understood this way, right? We're born into the world and there's a lot of yang qi, right? Children actually have a surplus of yin and yang, but it is primarily a yang time of life, right? They are growing rapidly, maturing rapidly, like the yang qi is dominant until they come to kind of middle age, at which point there is a natural decline and the yin grows and the yang declines. Life slows down, life becomes a little more gentle potentially, and they finally reach maximum yin, entering into a state of death. We see this cycle repeated throughout our lives, and our lives are these cycles within cycles. And we see the cycle of the year is the same. So the springtime, of course, is that kind of birth, the growing of yang. Yang comes to its maximum in the middle of the summer, at the summer solstice, right? The longest day of the year, the day when the sun is out the most, the sun, of course, being associated with yang, the light, the brightness, the expansion, the expansive energy. And then the years start to get shorter and the yin starts to grow until we reach maximum yin in the winter solstice, right? The shortest day of the year, the coldest day of the year, right? Cold being yin, yang being warmth, right? I suppose at some point I will go over the basic principles of yin and yang more fully, but I think most of it is relatively intuitive for this conversation. And so we have that in the cycle of the seasons, right? And like I said, the five phases, 5 elements are also mapped onto the cycle of the seasons, but we'll talk about that another time. We also see this in the monthly cycle, or I should say the lunar monthly cycle, right? Most cultures throughout history have had a calendrical system which understands months in terms of phases of the moon. It's only relatively recently in human history that we've superimposed this other calendar, the Gregorian calendar, onto the year for various reasons, I think originally kind of more political reasons than anything, which sort of detach our lives' rhythms from the natural cycles which we're embedded within. But really on all fronts, certainly in terms of the actual kind of natural world that we're a part of, it makes sense to think of the month as a lunar cycle. And lunar cycles tend to be 28 days. In Chinese medicine are understood to have a very integral effect on women's bodies, and specifically the menstrual cycle, which is approximately the same length and ideally links up with the moon. The new moon, the dark moon, is associated with yin. It's the most yin time of the month. And then from there, yang rises as the moon grows until the most yang time of the month, which is the full moon. And then from there, yin starts to grow, yang starts to decline until we arrive back at the new moon, the most yin time. So this is why ideally, I was just talking to a client about this. When a woman's body is functioning most healthily, she is menstruating on the new moon, the most yin time of the month, when the energy is sinking, because yin is a sinking energy, whereas yang is a rising energy. So the energy is sinking, supporting the sinking process of menstruation, the cleansing process, the yin calm time, right? Why ideally a woman's life is quite calm, quite gentle, quite relaxed during this time. And then ovulation would be around the yang time, right? The most yang time of the month, the time when the body is kind of most prepared for something yang, which is, if you look at this throughout the animal kingdom, right? Mating occurs most in this yang time of the month, right around the full moon. And because the energy is up the most, right? It's the most stimulating time. And then, of course, we have the cycle of the day and the cycle of the sun, which follows this waxing and waning of yin and yang as well. So of course, the middle of the night, midnight, is the most yin time. It's the darkest time. It's the time when ideally we are synchronizing our bodies with that by being asleep, which is the most yin activity, deeply asleep. And then throughout the day, yin declines as yang rises, and we find ourselves at high noon, the apex of yang, and then from there, yang declines and yin rises. And so with all of these things, these principles are important because when we understand them and we understand what aspects of lifestyle are more yin, what aspects of lifestyle are more yang, we can understand more easily the principles by which we want to live by, because ideally we are matching our body's rhythms with these rhythms of nature, because we are evolved to be in synchronicity with them. So for instance, if we wanted to be very active and exercise a lot, it would make the most sense to do that in the morning, in the yang time of the day. And indeed, there is understood to be kind of drop off of energy after the noon and after noon, and then kind of yin declines, right? It wouldn't be a natural thing or an ideal thing at 6 o'clock at night to do really, really vigorous exercise necessarily. It wouldn't be ideal. Of course, sometimes we need to do that for various reasons for our lives, but it's not ideal from a Yangsheng perspective. Or something we'll talk about when we talk about eating, right? In the biggest meal of the day, we want to be in the first half of the day, because the metabolism is the strongest, right? A yang process, the digestive system is strongest. There's the most yang qi to help to transform that food. Whereas in the evening, we actually want a smaller meal and we want it earlier, because we don't have as much yang to digest it, and we don't want it to stagnate in our body when we go to sleep at night. We see it in the seasons, right? The time we want to be the most active, the most yang, that's the summertime, right? The time we want to be the most yin, the most relaxed, the most calm, the most inward, that's the winter time. We want to rest the most in the winter time, right? We will create imbalances in our body if we're really, really active in the winter and then really, really lazy in the summer, right? We want to synchronize here. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, living out of harmony with these cycles, which today we almost all are for various reasons, is a cause of illness and disharmony. And we will definitely talk about that more. But it is one of the, of course, there's so many blessings to having temperature controlled and homes with electric lighting and stuff like this. But what it means is that we are, almost everyone, in some ways out of sync with these natural cycles that we are evolved to be in harmony with, right? We're not really evolved to, like, where I am right now. It's become late, and so it's dark outside, but I have lighting, so my body is receiving signals that it's actually light out, it's daytime. My body produces certain chemicals and hormones to support being awake because of that, whereas ideally, actually, the body is calming and going into a state of rest. So lots to say about that as we go. Now, there are different ways of conceiving of time, and different understandings of really what time is all about. As strange as that might sound, time is not just the same thing across cultures. And in the West, we tend to have what are called quantitative conceptions of time. We tend to think of time in terms of quantity, right? How much of this time do I have? How much time do I have? Do I have an hour? Do I have a day? Do I have a few minutes? We relate to time in terms of quantity, less in terms of quality. Whereas in other cultures, and certainly in traditional Chinese culture, I mean, really all cultures, as far as I can tell, prior to sort of modern industrialized Western culture, there was a more qualitative relationship with time. It's a relatively modern thing that we conceive of time in such a sort of reductive, purely quantitative, purely kind of numerical way. In traditional Chinese medicine, different times are understood to have different qualities. And this is really, really important, like we were just talking about, right? A certain time has a more yin quality or a more yang quality, but it gets much more complex than that even, right? Different times have qualities associated with the phase of fire, and thus the heart energy, or with the phase of wood, and thus the liver energy, those sorts of things. And we can feel this, right? This is, if we actually pay attention, which is a rare thing in this world, but if we really pay attention and are attentive to our bodies and to our lives, we find that different times have different qualities, right? If we're really attentive with the time when the sun is setting, that has a different visceral sort of texture to it than the rising of the sun, right? The early morning or the very middle of the day, right? These have different felt embodied qualities to them. And so tuning in and understanding and recognizing these different textures of time allow us to more efficiently and effectively harmonize our lives and our bodies with them. It also, it's beyond this class, but it's a notable thing. And I've taught about it before. I'll do a class on it at some point. That the way we even conceive of time has significant effects on our health and well-being. And in our culture, we tend to conceive of time in almost very spatializing terms, and in our dominant metaphors for time are talking about it as though it is a kind of material resource. We talk about wasting time, right? As though time is a thing that I can waste, right? We talk about lend you my time or give you my time, right? We talk about buying time, right? As though time is a material commodity that I can buy, or not worth my time, right? He wasn't worth my time. That wasn't worth my time. My time is more valuable. That way of talking about time, as common as it is, we can forget that time is not actually a thing that we have, right? It's not a thing that we have. It is, again, it's a process we're going through. And indeed, it's not just a process we are going through, it's a process that we are. We are time unfolding, right? Our bodies are a process unfolding through time. And so a lot of anxiety in our time is created through relating to time as a scarce resource that we do not have have enough of. Certainly, I think most people in our culture come up against that. Certainly, I have. And this way of relating to time creates an enormous amount of tension and is contrary to actual attentive presence and listening to the actual textures of time, which can only be understood and felt and in the present moment, right? Being with the time that we are actually in right now. So certainly an interest of mine and something that I will be returning to. But this is essentially what it comes down to is a matter of ting, of listening. The term ting is very commonly used in Taoist practice, less in Chinese medical texts, but from my perspective, it is really the fundamental principle for Yangsheng. Ting uses the metaphor of listening to refer to a particular type of kind of absorbed awareness, a type of sort of presence, similar to the concept of sati or mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, in Pali, which has become very common in the Western world. Of course, in the context of these cultivation traditions, mindfulness and ting refer to very particular cultivated qualities, which is relevant to spiritual practice, which is not really what I'm pointing to here. But what I am pointing out is that our ability to live skillfully and to harmonize our bodies with these different textures of time or these different cycles we're a part of, or know what our bodies need at different times or in different states, is wholly dependent on our ability to listen to them, is our ability to have an awareness of our embodied being, of ourselves, of what our system needs, and of what will promote wellness and well-being. So this character for Ting here is a really interesting one. And just to break it down, just because it points to what this quality is really about, we have the radical for eyes here, or sorry, for ears, indicating, of course, the auditory sense. We have the radical for eyes. That the radical for one, indicating kind of undividedness, a singularity to it. And then below that, we have the Shin, the character for Shin, which is heart or heart mind. In the Chinese tradition, the term heart does not just mean the heart as we think of it in the Western tradition. In the Western tradition, we tend to have a dichotomy of heart versus mind. But in this case, the heart represents it's often translated as heart mind because it represents the kind of opening of awareness within which the emotions, but also the thoughts kind of exist within. And so what we have here is talking about a kind of unified state of awareness and presence. And this is what we need to cultivate to skillfully engage Yangsheng, right? Because and this is, as we go further into this class, I'll wrap up for tonight shortly, and then we'll return to this class tomorrow. But what we'll see is that, we have in this tradition tons and tons of guidelines, which are very, very important, very, very skillful for healthy living. Telling us, eat at these times, eat these kinds of foods, don't those kinds of foods, these kinds of foods are good for this kind of imbalance, these are good for that kind of imbalance, go to sleep at this time of day, rest this much, do this, do that. All that is good and very important. It's very, very essential to have teachings kind of from the outside to help guide us in the right direction in our lives, which have been compiled through generations and generations of people listening very deeply to human life and to what supports human flourishing. And if we ourselves are not highly developed in the art of listening, then having these guidelines from past practitioners and masters and doctors guides us in the right direction. But at the highest levels, it's one thing to have someone for you. It's another thing to know for yourself by listening to your own body and having cultivated an awareness of your own body and your own life that allows you to make decisions for yourself. So this is really essential for Yangsheng. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for tonight, because the quality of time here for me is telling me that it's it's time to not be on the computer. So that's what I've got for you now, and we'll return to this tomorrow and finish this up. Basically, this class series, I'm gonna live stream every day for a while, and please tune in as you are interested to. I plan on covering a wide variety of topics, things that I've talked about and taught in the past, some things that are completely new for me. My orientation to medicine is broad, and I think in some ways a little broader than the conventional way of holding, well, certainly medicine in general in our culture, but even Chinese medicine. And so I will probably be doing classes on some classes on historical things, on the history of Chinese medicine, history of medicine in general, looking at different medical paradigms and where they came from. I will do classes on Yangsheng. I will do some classes that are aimed more for people who are already practitioners of Chinese medicine occasionally. I think I'll probably do some classes following through with some folks who I've taught herbal medicine to in the past, or for people who are already herbalists and want to look at different formulas and break them down. We'll probably do some classes where we look at classical formulas, break them down, and really do kind of deep dives on those formulas, which are useful for people who study Chinese medicine, but also even for people who just want more familiarity with the Chinese medical paradigm, to understand how we think. For anyone who's engaged with Chinese herbal medicine, to just have a sense of what the thought process is behind Chinese herbal medicine, because it's a beautiful and kind of wonderful thing. And some of these herbal formulas are so incredibly elegantly crafted and complex in the thought process behind them. It's an incredible thing to look at them, these sort of 2,000-year-old formulas, and kind of try to get inside of them, the mind of the people who crafted them, and then look at the myriad ways that they've been used by different practitioners through the ages. We'll probably do some of that, maybe some acupuncture theory. It's been requested that I do a deep dive on various different components of Yangsheng, so we're definitely going to do stuff on sleep cycle, stuff on certain types of exercise, probably a lot on diet. I myself am recently sort of recovered from an illness, which to me reminded me that I want to look more deeply at and remind myself of some Yangsheng principles in various ways, and so I'm offering these classes freely to anyone who's interested. So if you find it compelling or useful or interesting, please share with others. Share the info. It'll be on YouTube. It'll be on Facebook. It'll probably be on some other platforms as well. And if anyone sees this and has ideas or questions for particular topics, I'm happy to look at those. I'll keep a running list. It'll sort of be everything, kind of everything Chinese medicine, which for me is quite broad, and will include some looks at some more philosophical principles at different times, and even some looks at what I think are some misunderstandings in modern Chinese medicine, which need correction, in my opinion. So, yeah, so that's the plan. And we'll see how it goes. I'm excited about it. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I've got some friends who want to join along. So, anything else to say? I think that's it.